Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mobman coming at you again with another APUSH video. This is our fourth video focusing in on topic 3.10, Shaping a New Republic. Now, previously we were talking about the creation of the first ever cabinet in the Washington administration, but most of the time focusing in on the broad financial plan that Alexander Hamilton is going to be putting together as the first Secretary of the Treasury. Now, part of that plan that we didn't quite get to last time was the idea of trying to bring in more revenue. Because remember, that's part of Hamilton's plan, is to try to pay off any debt that we have globally, is to generate excise taxes on certain goods. Today, for example, we have excise taxes on gasoline and alcohol, and so there are certain products. Now note, speaking of alcohol, as part of Hamilton's excise tax plan, it did include a tax on whiskey. Now, when this tax is placed on whiskey sales, this is going to create a major uprising in Western Pennsylvania. And you might think, wow, why is there such an uprising? It's a small, tax on one specific good. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One should be pretty obvious. It's the idea that, we're pretty sensitive to taxes anyway. Remember, we're still, less than a generation removed from the start of the Revolutionary War. So the idea of a federal government, a faraway federal government from, say, Western Pennsylvania, imposing their will locally, that's reminiscent of sentiments that we had in the past. But really the bigger issue is what whiskey meant in that part of America. And what I mean by that part of America, I mean the frontier. Unlike East Coast towns and bigger cities where they did have more access to actual hard currency, if you lived out on the frontier like Western Pennsylvania was at that time, hard currency was hard to come by. But so in lieu of that, in lieu of hard currency or paper currency you could trust in any meaningful way, whiskey was a common form of currency out on the frontier. The general idea being is that, it's technically bartering, but whiskey was so popular with so many people as a product that, just about everybody wanted it. So you could actually trade that whiskey for all sorts of goods and services. So what would normally be a tax on somebody saying, hey, I want to purchase some whiskey, now you're talking about, since it is a tax on every time that whiskey is sold, if you are now using whiskey as currency, what that means in reality for these folks on the frontier is that now it's becoming a general sales tax. Now it's a tax on every type of transaction, which is, pretty odious to a lot of these folks with regards to a faraway central government that was imposing this. So, not unsurprisingly, you're going to see folks up in arms, folks, very upset. You're starting to see taxpayers be attacked again. Once again, a lot of that same sentiment that we saw back in the 1760s and 1770s. But note, this isn't Britain imposing the taxes. This is the American federal government. And note, they could not use the excuse taxation without representation. It was more along the lines of just an overreach of the federal government's authority, that it was becoming too authoritarian, too powerful. Now, this is going to be very significant, because when you see folks on the frontier in Western PA mobilize in a militaristic type of way, now you're seeing a real test of what the power is, the real power of the Constitution is. And this is significant, especially when you contrast it with the previous American government, the Articles of Confederation. You may recall that under the Articles of Confederation in 1787, you saw a bunch of, frontier farmers in Massachusetts upset with the government and was able to take up arms and basically topple the Massachusetts government, and showed tremendous weakness with what the national authority of the Articles of Confederation government could do, thereby necessitating the creation of the Constitution to replace it. So now we're seeing the Constitution facing a similar test to what the Articles of Confederation faced with Shays' Rebellion. But note, unlike with the Articles of Confederation, under the Constitution, we do have a centralized army. We do have a national executive branch. We do have a national president that has commander-in-chief powers. And George Washington, as that first president and as the commander-in-chief, is not going to be afraid to use that authority. You can see here in this depiction of Washington mobilizing the troops, you can see that Washington is not going to be afraid to use the federal government's authority to enforce this policy. And it really is remarkable because it's the only time in history, in American history, where the President of the United States actually gets into military uniform, mobilizes troops, and is prepared to go out on the battlefield leading the troops. That would be like today, Joe Biden, getting all camoed out and then, getting in a tank and leading the U.S. Army on a mission. So pretty wild stuff, especially by modern standards. Now, when word gets out that 15,000 federal troops led by the one and only George Washington was coming their way, this is going to really take the air out of the tires, so to speak, with regards to what this uprising was trying to accomplish. Now, there will be a few fatalities, just an overall very minimal casualties, thankfully. But more importantly, this shows that unlike with the Articles of Confederation, with Shays' Rebellion, this time around the federal government is able, under the Constitution, to actually enforce policy. So in this critical stress test, early on, unlike with the Articles, the Constitution will prove itself capable to enforcing that policy. Something else to be aware, in 1796, speaking of the frontier, we're going to see the Public Land Act pass. What this is going to do is use federal authority to allocate lands for private sales. You're going to be seeing millions and millions of acres of what was federal public land in the Ohio River Valley, eastern part of the Mississippi River Valley, Great Lakes region, etc., now starting to be opened up, with settlers starting to be settled by American settlers. Federal government is going to be selling this land for, wait for it, $2 an acre. Now, granted, yes, $2 was worth a lot more back then than it is today, but still, though, crazy cheap prices. And once again, the federal government has a vested interest in settling this territory, because if Americans don't settle it as far as the federal government is concerned, then you're almost inviting other foreign powers to test those boundaries, so to speak. All right, now, to round out this video, I wanted to kind of finally, in a very specific, organized way, go over something that I've kind of been implying in previous videos, and that is going to be one of the defining items that will take place in the 1790s. The 1790s is going to be a critical point in American history because it is going to be seeing the, in other words, the formation of institutions and traditions regarding American government that we still see today. Traditions, such as presidential elections every 4 years, as we'll get to later in a later video. The idea of a two-term presidential tradition, the creation of the Supreme Courts, and a whole bunch of other things, the cabinet, etc. But also we're going to see the formation of institutions that still, of course, hold sway today, and that's political parties. Now, the founders in the Constitution were nervous about factions and political parties. You may recall from the Federalist Papers that, the Constitution was designed in such a way so as to not eliminate factions, because Madison believed that you couldn't eliminate them, but to at least limit their power and authority. And that, proved pretty prescient because right off the bat, we get political parties. It's pretty much a natural thing. You're going to have differences of opinion in policy, and that creates different political parties. Now, the two major political parties of the 1790s and getting into the beginning of the 19th century will be Alexander Hamilton's Federalists and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. You're going to be seeing, important political leaders of the time lining up on both sides. John Adams is going to be a Federalist. George Washington, who never officially calls himself a Federalist, and in fact, John Adams doesn't really either. But George Washington especially, who claims to be above partisanship, above political parties, is going to say that he's not a Federalist, but if you actually look at his policies and you look at the successful influence of Alexander Hamilton, you could call Washington, certainly more Federalist than Democratic Republican. On the Democratic Republican side, aside Thomas Jefferson, you got James Madison, James Monroe, and a number of other important leaders. With regards to how the Constitution should be interpreted, we mentioned before that Federalists believe in a very strong federal government. And when interpreting the Constitution, the idea of doing it in a very broad way, loose constructionist, loose interpretation of the Constitution, really using that necessary and proper clause portion or the Commerce Clause portion as reasons to expand that federal authority. Now, Jefferson and Democratic Republicans, very fearful of a strong federal government. They're going to be what we would call strict constructionists. They believe that the best type of federal government is a relatively weak federal government. They're, of course, of the mindset that any additional power the federal government takes, that's going to come at the expense of the states. So Jefferson believed in robust, strong/local government. So these guys are going to be folks that generally tended to believe that unless it's specifically enumerated in the Constitution, that federal government shouldn't really have that authority. It should be a state power. As we mentioned previously, when it comes to foreign policy, Hamilton and the Federalists are going to be more pro-British. They look at Britain as our cultural cousins, that we have a already well-established trade relationship with them. So we should be more allied with them. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans looking more to France as, the country that was there for us when we needed it during the Revolution. These were folks that have been more willing to try to embrace the values of the Enlightenment, which were the philosophical foundation for our revolution. So understand that, the British-French, rivalry is certainly going to be something that is going to be dividing these early political parties. With regards to the military, once again, it kind of makes sense when you tie in, how the different parties believe what the federal power of the federal government's power should be. The Federalists believing that there should be a large standing army at all times, whereas the Democratic Republicans, they have a fear of what a permanent large standing army means. They still remember the days of British colonialism, the Redcoats, Boston Massacre, Lexington and Concord, etc., etc. The idea being is that we should not have a big standing army, a lot more focus on militias, etc., etc. With regards to economic policy, as we've said previously, the Federalist Party is certainly going to have a more kind of a progressive future mindset regarding economics. They had an idea that the federal government should be active in trying to aid the profitability of American businesses, supporting high tariffs to aid in that protection of American businesses, creating a strong national bank, all those kinds of things. So they believe in a very strong, robust, active federal government with regards to the economy. They certainly have a more modern idea of what the economy is going to be. It's going to be based on manufacturing, international trade, etc. Jefferson has a little bit more of a traditional attitude regarding the economy. In his version of a perfect America, Jefferson believed that it would be a nation of what he would call yeoman farmers, small-time farmers, people growing stuff to subsist and maybe trade with their local neighbors and relatives and things like that. Voicing the views of a lot of these, small to mid-sized farms. Jeffersonians are going to be against a big national bank. They fear the banks are tyrannical towards farmers. They don't like big tariffs because tariffs mean to customers, unlike business owners, tariffs to customers mean higher prices. So he has a much more pastoral, traditional idea, rural notion of what the economy in America should be. Hamilton has a much more modern, urban manufacturing idea of what we live in. And of course, think about whose America we really live in. Think about that. The answer is Hamilton. And then lastly, who are going to be the major supporters of each of these parties? Not a huge surprise given what we already talked about. The Federalists are going to have a lot of support with northern business owners, merchants, folks from New York and Boston, Philadelphia, places like that, large landowners. It's going to be viewed as the party of more of the urban elites, those kinds of folks. They tended to not be huge fans of the masses, so to speak, didn't really trust the masses. Whereas Jefferson is going to feel like his party represents the values of the masses, the small-time farmer, southern plantation owners, things like that. So certainly more of the common man party, Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, than Federalist Party, which tend to be more of viewed as an elitist party. Okay, we're going to leave it there for now. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.